do a little introduction of Chris, give you an idea of where he comes from. This is his third visit to the COO Forum. And every time Chris comes to our sessions, we always walk away with new perspectives and insights on the economy and our businesses and just what's going on in the world. He's managing director of Armada Corporate Intelligence and is one of the co-founders of the company. He's been with Armada as their chief or the economic analyst, and has worked in a variety of private clients and professional associations for the last 18 years. He's chief editor for the Business Intelligence Brief. It's distributed to all around the world by business organizations, and is one of the primary writers for the Black Owl Report. He also makes probably more than 100 presentations each year to business and industry associations throughout the US and overseas. And he holds a doctorate in political economics, an advanced degree in Soviet studies and Asian studies, and was a professor of international economics and finance for over 15 years before joining Armada. I'd like to turn it over to Chris, who's probably going to take over the screen with his slides, but I'm just very grateful that you're here, Chris, and looking forward to another wonderful time with you.
Well, you're so welcome. And so I am going to share my slides because I'm pretty sure that it is actually illegal in most states for an economist to speak without slides. So that's just kind of the deal. And as the introduction indicated, I have kind of a misspent youth. I actually started out in the 1980s as a Soviet analyst. I was going to make a career out of studying the evil empire and work for the agency and be a spook, and I was all set to go. And then they go out of business right in the middle of my PhD. So I ended up writing a nasty letter to Mikhail Gorbachev saying, "You couldn't have waited a year for me to finish my defense. I mean, really, you have to go out of business now." So I metamorphosed into a slightly more normal economist. But all of a sudden, I am relevant again. The Cold War is back. And so everybody else is upset. And I'm like, yay, I can use my old knowledge. And by the way, the very first phrase I ever learned in Russian is appropriate for today. It was Slava Bogu Savodny Pyatnitsa. Thank God it's Friday. So you are now entitled to use that anywhere you like. So where to begin? Right now, it's pretty fun being an economist, if fun is defined by having a lot to talk about, and there certainly is. I am, by the way, from Kansas, which is why I can make fun of the Wizard of Oz legally. We're sort of committed to that. But it just struck me as we were trying to come up with titles for this: recession, inflation, and war. Oh my, I mean, we're suddenly dealing with all kinds of stuff. What I have characterized my discussions as of late is kind of talking people off a ledge. It's not that the problems that we're dealing with now are insignificant. We are obviously seeing inflation, the likes of which we've not seen in decades. We obviously are seeing some indicators that are very concerning when it comes to things like recession. However, there's a tendency on the part of the media to overblow things a little. And, we're kind of used to this. I mean, it's the old adage used to be that if it bleeds, it leads. And I'm convinced that people in the media don't find economics very interesting. So they're constantly sort of blowing it out of proportion. And we certainly hear a lot of commentary that can be a little carried away. One of my cautionary notes, and you guys have been, I'm sure, dealing with this your whole lives, is consider the source. Who is telling you what, and what is their background, and what is their orientation? For example, and I'm not casting aspersions by any means, but earlier this week, there was a commentator who was running a oil trading company out of Europe and was sort of presenting this really dire prediction when it came to oil prices. He was talking about the emergence of a parabolic curve in the price per barrel of oil. 150, 160, $170 a barrel oil. The world would come to an end. And it was picked up by most of the major media sources, and very, very upsetting. And if this was to come to pass, I mean, it would be catastrophic on all kinds of levels. But as I'm watching this and listening to the guy, I'm saying, does anybody notice that He is the CEO of a company whose number one job is transporting Russian oil by sea. This is exactly what the European Union is in the process of trying to embargo. So it would not be out of the realm of possibility for the CEO of a firm that is going to be severely impacted by this decision to start suggesting that it's a bad decision. Does it mean that there's going to be an oil crisis of this magnitude that affects the world? Probably not. Would a European embargo of seaborne Russian oil crush his company? Absolutely. So it's just kind of a warning to pay attention to who's saying what, why they might be saying it. I tend to be a fairly conservative economist in the great scheme of things. My economic hero has always been Milton Friedman. And I always have to go back to one of his more cogent sayings, which is follow the money. If you want to know what's going on in the world, it's probably a good idea to sort of figure out who's making money, who's losing money, what decision is going to affect that equation. And obviously, as chief operating officers, you people deal with this every day. You know, what is and what is not going to affect my business. So with that, it's kind of a preface. We heard a lot earlier this year about the inverted yield curve and how this was one of those things that indicates an imminent recession. Well, in the first place, it's rarely imminent. It's often predicting something that may happen within 6 months to 2 years. So it's a pretty long wait in some cases. The other thing to note is that the curve inverted, but it then stopped inverting. So right now, it's not in inversion territory at all. And frankly, the Fed doesn't pay a lot of attention to it. They are a whole lot more interested in the 10-year 3-month spread more than the 10-year 2-year spread. More to the point, if you look at what the New York Fed has been saying about recession, they're kind of the arbiters of the Fed's position on this. John Williams is currently the head of the New York Fed. He used to be the head of the San Francisco Fed, one of the permanent members of the Board of Governors. They don't get worried about recession until the percentage gets close to 20%. Right now, it's 3.7. We're a long, long way from a recession circumstance as far as the Fed is concerned. Obviously, this can change fast, and there are things that could trigger the Fed to do certain things, but the Fed has been fairly explicit, and have all the other central banks, as to what they really see and what they think they can do about what's going on right now. Frankly, what triggers a recession is a reaction to inflation. I mean, it's not all of the thing that triggers a recession, but that's sort of the number one motivator. The central banks will look at an inflation situation like we have now, and they'll say, look, we need to control this. We have a dual mandate. We are supposed to control the monetary policy. We are supposed to control inflation by manipulating interest rates. We are also supposed to be promoting growth. We're also supposed to be promoting full employment, again, predominantly through interest rates. So the number one tool they have, really the only tool they have, is the Fed funds rate, or the equivalent for the European Central Bank or the Bank of England or Bank of Japan, any of the other central banks. The Fed funds rate, and you're all aware of this, but a lot of people aren't, is literally just the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans. Every single day, banks make deals and have obligations and issued loans, and they rarely have enough money on hand to cover what they just did, and they're required to. So they go on to the overnight market and borrow money from each other in order to cover the obligations they incurred that day. It's very routine, and that rate is always very low. From that rate, you derive all the others. So the banks look at the Fed funds rate, and that's how they determine prime. That's how they deal with mortgages. That's how they deal with car loans, anything else. It's not lockstep. There is no guarantee that every bank is going to be in sync with every other bank. Some banks are slower to adjust their rates than others. There's always a certain amount of flexibility, but it is an indirect tool at best. What they're trying to do is either soak money up and bring it out of the economy with higher rates, or they're trying to push more money into the economy with lower rates. Since 2008, the whole focus has been stimulus. It has been try to get as much money into the economy as possible. We dropped rates to zero after the financial crisis of 2008, and they've essentially stayed there for the better part of a decade. That's the unusual part. Seeing rates come up now, that's normal. That's going back to what we saw prior to 2008. The anomaly is where we've been for the last decade. You've had a sort of a sea change in terms of central bank behavior saying we really need to keep stimulating. 2008 was a devastating global recession, much more dangerous than the one we saw in 2020. We have to keep pumping. We have to keep putting money into the system. So the rates have stayed very low, and we've gotten used to it. You know, we're not accustomed to variety when it comes to rates anymore. And now we're kind of going back to that kind of thinking, and we're sort of prepared for it, but not entirely. So a few other things that tend to be indicators of recession. You know, the GPDI is continuing to trend in the right direction, rose by 18% year over year, was high 3% quarter over quarter. There have only been 4 false positives in the last 80 years, and there's never been a recession when it's tracking below zero. We're not in that territory right now. So gross private domestic investment is still high. You're seeing it from the business community, you're seeing it from the consumer. Show a little bit more with the next couple of slides, but there's still a lot of spending, which does also indicate that the Fed can have some impact on that with higher rates. And that's one of the reasons the Fed is continuing to look at hiking rates, even though most of the inflation that we're dealing with right now is not connected to this spending. And we'll get to that as we go. But the two motivators for inflation, neither one of which the Fed has any control over, energy prices and the supply chain. No matter what the Fed does with interest rates, no matter what any central bank does with interest rates, they can't have an impact on the energy market because that is connected to the Ukraine war. Why do we have an energy crisis? There's no shortage of oil, plenty of oil. There's more oil than demand justifies. If all of the oil that was in availability, that from Russia and everybody else, was in circulation, we'd have a glut. We'd have a situation where oil prices would be falling. Because if you look at consumption patterns, both here and in Europe, pretty much anywhere, we're consuming a lot less oil. We're not commuting. The number one thing we do to consume fuel in the United States is commute. And as long, and we'll talk about this in a minute, as long as 40% of us are working in the office and 60% are remote, we're not commuting. So if the oil that is being held up in Russia was on the market, we would have a glut. We'd have more oil than we knew what to do with. But that oil is not on the market. 70% of Russia's oil has no market right now. It's in storage. We'll get back to what that really means in a minute. So we have some sort of odd motivators, supply chain being the other one. We don't really have a shortage of goods either. The productivity in China is not necessarily down. It's down a little because of the restrictions that came in with COVID, but mostly it's a transportation issue. The fact that the ports in China are still being shut down. Just today, Shanghai was shut down again. They were opening up the Shanghai system because the feeling was that more control over COVID. Well, they found a whopping 11 new cases of COVID and restrictions are back. China is still pursuing this zero tolerance approach, which the rest of the world has decided is ludicrous, and they're not trying to do it, but China still is. And as a result, you still have this supply chain situation with congested ports in China. We'll come back to that too. Next slide, again, is encouraging. This is capital spending by business. Very strong monthly barometer to watch. You obviously deal with a lot of this in the capacity as COO. Some of this is explained by trying to get ahead of potential interest rate hikes. So we've always seen behavior like this when from consumers and business. If you think rates are going to go up and if you think things are going to get more expensive, well, buy now. I mean, there's always been one of the ironies of economic theory is that what's good for the individual is bad for the economy. If you're worried about inflation, the last thing you want people to do is to hurry up and spend like mad trying to beat inflation, because then that guarantees you're going to get inflation. What the economists would tell people to do, which no one ever will, is like, we're facing inflation, quit spending. Like, well, no, I'm not going to quit spending. I want to buy a big screen TV, and it's only going to get more expensive by the end of the summer. So I'm going to buy two now. And business is the same. Business has also been spending heavily on building up inventory. The supply chain crisis has forced people to rethink that entire chain. It's not reliable anymore. Just in time is metamorphosing. It's now going from just in time to eventually maybe. And that's not a very good position for companies to be in. So they're loading up. I mean, just to give a goofy example, but it kind of indicates how pervasive this is. I was out in Western Kansas giving a talk to a predominantly agricultural audience, as one would expect in Western Kansas. The gentleman that was on the panel is, first off, the exemplar of an extended work career. He's 93 years old and still running his company. He manufactures storage tanks for agricultural purposes. So he gets up in front of this group and he says, when I was a younger man, they talked me into sourcing my valves out of China because I could save some money. So I did. Well, now those dang valves are stuck on a ship someplace and I can't get access to them. And I have a bunch of farmers who are not very happy with me because I can't deliver the tanks because I don't have valves. He says, from here on out, if we don't make something in Garden City, Kansas, I ain't using it. And the minute he said that, this guy shoots his hand in the air and says, "Sir, I used to make your valves. And I stopped because you started sourcing out of China. So I'm willing to go back into the business of sourcing your valves, but I need a guarantee that you're not going to do that to me again, that you're not going to suddenly start to decide to source from someplace else. I want a 20-year contract." And the guy says, "Well, I'm 93, you can have it." So there are some advantages to age. So we're seeing a lot of inventory build. The other thing that's happening to encourage business investment is related to the labor force. As people have struggled to find the talented people they need, keep the talented people they need, they're shifting more and more to automation, technology, and robotics, particularly in manufacturing, but even in construction, even in the service sector. That has driven investment because people are now buying these machines, buying the technology that they need to basically reduce their exposure to workforce wage creep. I mean, it just comes down to the fact that I can't find the people I want, and if I do find them, they're expensive, and I'm going to be paying that cost forever. The challenge with a lot of productive costs, commodities go up and down. A lot of things change as far as sourcing. Once wages go up, they stay up. And so once you've made a commitment, again, just as an example that's creeping into the service sector, was talking to a McDonald's franchise owner in Southern California who runs about 20 restaurants that are entirely automated. And he said, I just got to doing the math. And order to meet the demand, it's not just that minimum wage has gone up here. It's just that practically speaking, if I want to hire people, I've got to pay that much or more. It was going to cost me $350,000, $400,000 a year in additional labor costs. So I go ahead and spend the million and a half on technology. It's more in the first year, but now that I've bought it, I don't have to buy it again. I don't have to keep spending that 400,000 a year on my wage structure. So that's a lot of what's been driving business investment. Another thing that we're all aware of, and becomes more painfully obvious when we look at a chart. We don't save. This is not a country that saves much. Our average has always been around 6, 7, 8% at most. Japan, Asian countries generally save at twice that rate. Europe is almost a third to a quarter higher than we are as far as saving is concerned. But along comes 2020, and suddenly we're saving because we had no choice. We had done all the things that you're supposed to do during a recession. We were pumping money into the economy, trying to make sure that the consumer had all the wherewithal they needed to spend our way out of the recession. The only thing we forgot is that if you give people lots of money and then you close everything they spend their money on, you're not going to get much advantage. 65% of what we spend our money on is services. If you're in the upper 20% of income earners, 80% of what you spend your discretionary income on is services. When you're in the upper income category, you already have all the things you need. You've got a house, you've got a car, you've got big screen TVs in the bathroom, you have a boat, you have toys, you have golf clubs, you have all that. Now you're going out to eat to nice restaurants. Now you're going on nice vacations. You're going to play golf with those golf clubs. Those are all services. And those services were absolutely slammed in 2020 because we were forcibly shutting them down. We didn't have any place to spend our money, so we hung on to it. And at one point in 2020, in the second quarter, we were saving at a 38% rate, which is just insane. We never saved that much money. That money then came cascading out in 2021. We began 2021, if you remember back to the beginning of that year, we were convinced we had defeated COVID. We had the vaccine now, and all these assumptions were made. It was like, okay, we have a vaccine. Everyone's going to take it in the next month or two. The entire country will be vaccinated, and we've got this under control, and we know what we're dealing with, and we can call off all the restrictions and go back to normal. Well, that was prior to discovering that there's a Delta variant and then there's an Omicron variant, and also discovering that half the population is convinced that vaccines were developed by the devil incarnate and they weren't going to take them. So suddenly we had the problem again and things slowed down. But for that 2 or 3 month period, we spent like crazy. And we started the year out with about 5 trillion in excess savings. We blew through all of that by the end of the year. During that year, we stressed the system. Production couldn't keep up because they had shut down during 2020. We had a transportation bottleneck because we couldn't keep up with the demand there either. We had just a whole series of inflationary pressures coming from the fact that we were spending as aggressively as we were, at least for the first half of that year. We slowed down in the second half of 21 because now we were dealing with Delta and Omicron, and the restrictions were back, and people had kind of gotten it out of their system. So the kind of thing that the Fed would try to put pressure on had more or less evaporated by the end of 2021, but the impact was still being felt. We still had all of these labor shortage situations and supply chain pressure and production pressure. And then we get Black Swan number 2, which is the Ukraine war. Black swan events are these things that economists coined the term for probably 25 years ago to explain why it is we're wrong so often. So it's like, well, we weren't expecting it. We didn't think we were going to get hit by COVID. We knew we were going to get hit by a virus. We had been every year. I mean, we've dealt with Marburg and Ebola and avian flu and MERS and SARS and Zika. I mean, every year. But there was nothing like COVID. Wasn't as deadly as the others, not as deadly as SARS, not as deadly as MERS, certainly not as deadly as Ebola or Marburg, but it spread like nothing we'd ever seen short of measles. So it was weird. We didn't know what to do with it. Now we're dealing with the black swan of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which we'll get to in a minute. And it threw things off again. We knew Russia had designs on Ukraine, didn't know when this was going to develop. Yet another slide to indicate that things are not quite as bleak as they would appear. Retail sales are still up. They're still above trend. And it's partly accounted for by inflation because we're seeing people spend more money, but this is CPI adjusted. So this is adjusted for that inflation impact, and it's still above trend. People are still spending on sales of various things, food service, travel. We've certainly seen prices increase for things, but have people actually stopped consuming? Not that I've noticed. I mean, some of the more sensitive areas to consumer demand is travel. And in past years, we have seen definite responses to higher airfares, all the different accoutrement that it's not just airfares. I mean, if you're traveling, hotels are more expensive and rent cars are more expensive and everything's more expensive. Has it slowed people down? Nope. Every airplane I'm on, packed to the gills. I haven't seen an empty middle seat in months, and probably won't for many more months. So we're still spending. Will that start to slow down? Probably. We're beginning to see a certain amount of triage right now, where people are having to spend money on necessities that have become more expensive, which is going to limit what they can do with discretionary purchasing. And you're seeing the big retailers respond to this. Target is now reducing the inventory that it's purchasing from its suppliers because it doesn't think it's going to be able to sell the discretionary items the way they have in the past. New packaging requirements, they're putting a lot more emphasis, like Target, Walmart, grocery stores, on half-gallon milk cartons rather than gallon, because people are starting to make those determinations. We'll probably see more decline in what we refer to as the little luxuries. Maybe, 2 or 3 fewer caramel macchiato lattes from Starbucks per day, because gas prices have gone up. Commodity shortages are all over the place. We've definitely seen these jump. No big surprise here. But one of the things to point out as far as how the media covers things, and I don't really mean to be a media basher, but it just seems to happen. A few months ago, there was a lot of conversation about, gee, the Fed was so wrong. The Fed was saying that inflation was transitory, and look, it's not transitory. It's anything but transitory. It's not temporary. And I just wanted to throw something at the TV and say, children, transitory does not mean temporary. Transitory is Fed speak. The Fed has its own language. We're all aware of this. We know that every single word that comes out of the Fed's mouth is parsed 20 ways from Sunday as people are trying to figure out what it actually means. And transitory refers to commodity-based inflation. It isn't necessarily temporary. It could last for a long time. But the Fed looks at these charts and says commodities always look like an EKG. They peak and they fall. They peak and they fall. They peak and they fall. They do it with annoying regularity and have done it for decades. For the most obvious of reasons, it's a commodity. It is not something that is differentiated the way other products are. If you're producing oil, granted there are differences in types of oil, but it's oil. So if you're producing in Libya or Brazil or Canada or North Dakota, it's oil, and it's priced similarly. So if there is a demand for something, anybody who can produce it is going to produce it. And every time the commodity price gets high, you're going to see all kinds of new entrants into that business because, hey, there's an opportunity. Looking at agriculture, one of the things that I also point out is that whether something is a good thing or a bad thing depends a lot on where you are. When the price of wheat was skyrocketing earlier this year, because we were not getting access to the wheat from Russia and Ukraine, which combined account for 25% of world wheat production, everybody in the world was upset except for farmers in the Midwest who produce wheat, particularly the ones who had planted winter wheat, because they were harvesting right when these prices were going up, and they had not had to pay high input prices when they planted. They were putting it in when gas prices were low, when fertilizer prices were low, and they made a killing off of winter wheat. Those that are harvesting later this year, they'll make money too, but not as much because they've had higher input costs. The point is that commodities go up and down, they're transitory. And when the Fed talks about transitory numbers, it's just simply acknowledging that when the demand for commodities becomes intense, it will eventually drive the prices down because you'll get a lot more entries into the business simply because there's money to be made doing that. So a little bit of a deviation into the joys of the Ukraine war, just so we can, have that as a reference point. One of the things that is inhibiting the oil producers is the notion that this can't go on forever, and it can't. Ukraine cannot keep this up indefinitely, and neither can Russia. This has become a colossally expensive proposition for Russia. It has not turned out the way they thought it would. If you go back to the very beginnings of this, the assumption was this would be over in 2 weeks. Putin really thought that this was just going to be a repeat of his invasion of Crimea in 2014. He would come in, he would take over the territory, there'd be a mild response on the part of the West because there's nothing he can do about it, and the Ukrainians would be unable to stop it, and it would all be over. I mean, he told most of his military that these were military maneuvers, that it wasn't even a war. And he told the population, oh, there won't be any casualties, don't worry about it. The Ukrainians have killed over 30,000 Russian soldiers to date, 12 generals. And it's like, well, this isn't panning out the way you thought. So sooner or later, it has to end. When it does, even when it starts to move in that direction, the per barrel price of oil drops like a stone. It could drop 30, 40, 50 bucks overnight because suddenly all of that oil would start to come back on market. If there is a movement to end this, practically speaking, we know what's going to happen. We're going to have to incent the Russians to keep moving towards some settlement. In order to do that, we're going to have to reduce some of the sanctions. We are definitely not going to reduce them on the financial sector. We're not going to take pressure off the oligarchs. We are still angry at Putin. We are going to do as much punishment as we can, but we want the oil and gas. So it'll be, if you behave and you actually try to move towards settlement, we'll cut you a break. We'll let you start selling some more of your oil and gas. It's a pretty self-serving approach, but that's the reality. That product coming on the market and doing it literally overnight would turn a shortage into a glut. And the oil sector is well aware of it. They're like, look, we're not going to put a lot of emphasis into developing something that's not going to hit the market for 8, 9, 12 months when this whole thing could end in 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months. We don't know when. Nobody does. Same thing with fertilizer prices. Same thing with manufacturing materials. There's an artificial shortage. There's no shortage of oil, really. It's just that the third largest producer can't distribute it. The Russians are selling to other countries, to China, to India, but on their terms. The Chinese said, hey, we'll buy your oil, but we're going to pay you 60 bucks a barrel. We're not going to pay 120 or 110 or 100 or 90. We'll pay you 60. And the Russians are like, well, yeah, but the world price is, yeah, I don't care what the world price is. If you want to sell at the world price, sell it somewhere else. Oh, yeah, you can't, can you? You can only sell to us. We're not in the business of helping you, Russia. We're China. We help ourselves. Right now, you're in a bad position. We weren't going to get some cheap oil out of you. And it's as simple as that. So there are just a lot of things about this conflict that are building up to some kind of crescendo. And the Russians not really even understanding what they're up against. They did not anticipate the Europeans backing the sanctions. Putin was essentially waiting for Angela Merkel to leave office. The one person he thought was in a position to rally Europe was Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany. She decided to retire, and when she stepped down as Chancellor, the elections brought Olaf Scholz to power. Olaf Scholz is with the Social Democrats, not the Christian Democrats that Merkel was part of. Social Democrats are center left and have traditionally been a little more pro-Russian than the norm in Germany. The assumption on the part of the Russians was that Germany would bow out, that they would not participate in these sanctions, would not exert their power, because A, they needed Russian gas and still do, and the ability of the new German chancellor to influence Europe was minimal. But what Putin did not understand was German politics. The only reason Olaf Scholz is chancellor is that he created an alliance, a coalition with the Greens. So Annalena Baerbock is the head of the Greens. She despises Putin to the core of his soul. First off, her family is East German, so they don't have any love lost for the Russians anyway. Beyond that, she accounts Putin as virulently bad for the environment. And she's right. I mean, Russia has pursued policies that are absolutely miserable from an environmental point of view. And she doesn't like him for that reason alone. So she literally told Scholz, do you like being chancellor? Do you want to be chancellor for 2 weeks? Because if you don't back these sanctions, I quit the coalition and I'll go unite with the Christian Democrats. At which point Olaf Scholz is like, oh, so tell me about these sanctions of yours. I'm very interested. I don't want to be the world's shortest chancellor. So suddenly Germany is at the forefront of the sanctions, and Europe is on board, and the US is on board, and the sanctions start to bite. Russia is also dealing with all kinds of issues around corruption, to be honest. We were noting that the Russian tanks were running out of fuel. How do you run out of fuel when you're invading? Well, the problem was that the company or the drivers that were transporting the fuel were selling it to the Ukrainians. And someone said, well, why are you selling the tank fuel to the Ukrainians? Ukrainians, they're paying with dollars and euro, not stinking rubles like Russians do. But the Ukrainians are going to use it to kill your people. Those are not my people. Those are tank people. They're sitting up on their tanks like they're so very important. We're truck people. They don't shoot at us. They just want to buy our oil. This is a country that is very, very self-oriented. Corruption is endemic in Russia and always has been. You know, it's just that was the only way you could survive. I mean, it was and still is. So people watch out for number one, and they don't really have, there's not a lot of unity. I mean, we've been watching the Russian maneuvers where it's like there's almost no coordination. The Ukrainians are fighting almost like a single person. You know, they're defending their territory, and we could go on for hours, but we won't. You know, I'm enjoying my return to my Soviet analytical days a little too much. So, impact on the global economy, no big surprise. Brent crude up, natural gas up, everything's up. I mean, you're dealing with both an artificial demand factor, which occurred in 2021, and then you dump these latest problems with the latest black swan on top of it. The economies that will be affected most, no big surprise, Russia at the top, Europe and the UK getting hit pretty hard. The US is not thus far feeling a lot of this. I mean, we're more in a support role. We've obviously seen it when it comes to energy inflation. We've obviously seen it when it comes to some of the impact around our relationship, excuse me, with Europe. But we don't import much from Russia of any kind. We don't import commodities from them. We don't import manufactured goods from them. We have very little to do with Russia, really. So it's not something that has affected our economy directly. We're still being affected more by the supply chain mess in China than what's going on in Russia. Even things like the price of fuel, the main reason that diesel prices have gone so high, we're still producing a lot of diesel. We're sending 10 times more of it to Europe than we ever did before. We are trying to help the Europeans cope with this crisis, so we're sending them a tremendous amount of the diesel output that we normally would be keeping for ourselves. So before I get to this chart and talk about it in some detail, I just want to kind of throw out that if there are any questions at this point, I'd be more than happy to grab them. And I think Laura's keeping track of it for me. So is there anything anybody wants to comment on before we discuss why 2021 was so weird? Do you see anything in the chat box, Laura?
I think that's your green flag to get moving on the next slide.
All right, very good. So we will move to 2021. That is the anomalous year, and that in many ways sets us up for 2022 because we never grow that fast. We grew at almost 6%. In the second quarter of 2021, we were at one point growing at 9.6%. We never grow that fast. We overwhelmed the economy. We were not able to keep up from a production perspective, from a transportation perspective. That's when we started seeing all the labor issues start to manifest. I mean, for 4 months in a row now, we have had record rates in the quit category. The quit rate is something that is tracked by the Job Opportunity Labor Turnover Survey, JOLTS. And generally, it's not a particularly high number. Quitting is different than changing jobs. If you just took another position and moved from one to the other, that's not a quit. A quit is you wake up in the morning and you say, good Lord, I hate my job. I hate the people I work with. I hate the people I work for even more. There's got to be something better than this. I just quit. And then you start looking for something else, or maybe you don't. Maybe it's like, well, I've got enough money to live on for a couple months and I'm just not even going to look at all. I'm going to play around for a while and then worry about it. The quit rate gets high when there's this assumption that there's plenty of opportunity, that whenever I decide to get back into the workforce, I'll have my choice and there's no hurry. You don't get that unless you're growing at an astronomical pace. And 6-point growth is astronomical from the perspective of the United States, particularly when it comes off of a year when we were well below that. We're just now adjusting to getting back to normal. We're getting back to a growth rate probably by the end of this year, 2.5%, maybe 3, more likely 2.5 to 2. But that's normal. That's where we've been for the better part of 2 decades. So we are getting into a slower pattern, but it's really in comparison to a really fast pattern, an unnaturally fast pattern last year. Global inflation, we're in fairly good company. There's an awful lot of countries that are in the same category as we are. Be glad you're not in Venezuela. They have 500% inflation. Or you could be in, I don't know, Sudan and be dealing with 245%. There are a few countries that are not seeing a lot of inflationary pressure right now. And if you look, particularly in Europe, it's the Scandinavian states and France. Part of the reason that they're not seeing as much inflation, that's more energy independent territory. France is still largely nuclear. 85 to 90% of their power comes from nuclear energy. So they're not experiencing the gas and oil crisis that the rest of Europe is experiencing. Scandinavia, well, that's Norway. And Norway is one of the big oil producers in Europe, and they supply Sweden and Finland. And Denmark. So the Scandinavian states have not seen as high an inflation rate either. Australia has been largely immune, partly because they're a commodity exporter. So we're kind of in the same boat as most of Europe, most of South Asia, most of Latin America, and it's high, but not cripplingly so. We're in that kind of 5 to 10% range, kind of on the high end of that, and may start to see some of that decline even by the end of this year. So what does the Fed do with all of this? At the end of the day, this is the critical decision that will or will not push us into a recessionary mode. First off, it's good to remember interest rates used to be a lot higher. I mean, if you go back to prior to 2008, We thought an interest rate of 4 or 5% was normal. We'd been there for years. So having rates that were zero, that was the unusual part. And now all of a sudden we're stair-stepping our way back to something that is still considerably less than it was prior to the 2008 recession. And I don't want to go into too much gory detail on FedThink, but the decision about rates is made by the Open Market Committee. The Open Market Committee is made up of the Board of Governors plus 4 regional Fed presidents. These 4 regionals have a lot of influence because there are 12 Fed districts. These guys rotate in for 1-year terms, and they're sort of the eyes and ears of the Fed. They're out in the various cities all over the country that are running Fed districts, and they're the ones responsible, for example, for putting out the beige book, which I'm sure you all commit to memory as soon as it comes out. You know, leave it to the economists to name an incredibly important book, the beige book. How exciting. You know, you couldn't call it the red book or no, it's the beige book, just to make sure that everyone's asleep when they're reading it. But this is the report on what's going on in those 12 districts. Last year, the 4 members that were on the Open Market Committee were either doves or at least neutral on rates. This year, you have 3 of the most hawkish members of the Fed on that Open Market Committee. You have Esther George from Kansas City, Loretta Mester from Cleveland, and Jim Bullard from St. Louis. Esther and Loretta have been hawks for a long time. If you go back to 2008, when we first dropped the rates down to 0, it was an 11-to-1 vote with the Open Market Committee. The one dissenter was Tom Honig from the Kansas City Fed. And he did not like the idea of lowering rates that low because it distorts savings and it messes with the stock market. Esther is his disciple. So she picked up right where Tom left off and continues to warn against low interest rates. When she speaks, she is this charming, diminutive, middle-aged woman until the subject of inflation comes up, and then she sounds like something out of The Exorcist. I mean, it's just, she's not happy with low rates. Loretta Mester was the head of research under Charles Plosser at the Philadelphia Fed. Plosser was one of the most hawkish members of the Fed for decades, and at one point even suggested that a normal interest rate should be 15%. And at this point, people were like, for God's sakes, Chuck, that's going to destroy banking. He says, yeah, I know, but borrowing is bad for you, and you shouldn't do it. Loretta's not quite that extreme, but she's no big fan of low interest rates either. Bullard tends to run hot and cold. Sometimes he's hawk, sometimes he's dove. Right now, he's in a hawkish mood. The 4th member is just coming on, I think, in July. Eric Rosengren would have been the 4th member from the Boston Fed. He retired early, and his replacement was picked, I think, in February. Dr. Susan Collins, who is not the senator from Maine, but an economist from Michigan. She is due to come on as the new head of the Boston Fed, I think, in July. So she hasn't even met with this group yet and probably won't play a big role this year, just as she gets kind of familiar with her new job. She's also not a monetarist as an economist. She's more an international person, but she will be the first Black woman to serve on the Fed's Open Market Committee. So that's kind of a new change. The Fed also has a new Board of Governors member, Black woman, first Black woman to be on the Board of Governors. I'm trying to think where she was from. She's another economist. She might even be from Michigan too. Anyway, I digress. The Fed is probably going to be in that 2.5 to 3.5 range by the time you get to the end of the year. So pushing it up incrementally, but there's not a lot of suggestion that they're going to get radical. They're probably going to move things by 0.5 point, maybe wait a meeting, do it again, wait a meeting, see if the economy reacts, but they're keeping their eye on oil, gas, supply chain. If those things change, then that's going to have a lot to do with their decision making going forward. So a few things also to provide some encouragement. And I know you guys look at this a lot. This is one of CEO's favorite studies for all kinds of obvious reasons. The Purchasing Managers Index is very useful because of three characteristics. Number one, it's a survey and it's current. So it comes out every month, and it's one of the few data points that you can get at the beginning of the month. Doesn't lag. A lot of the government data, just by its nature, has to lag, and it's 2 or 3 months before you know what's going on. PMI is a survey, so it comes out promptly. As a survey, it's also accurate, which is rare. A lot of surveys aren't. People either fudge them or they don't know how to answer. My least favorite survey is the Consumer Confidence Survey. You get a phone call in the middle of the day. Are you feeling confident? I guess, sure, why not? It's Friday. What do you want from me? We know that when you ask people on a Friday if they're confident, they're more likely to say yes than if you ask them on a Monday. It's not a very reliable survey. But you ask a purchasing manager, are you buying more or less steel? More. How come? I don't know. I don't even know what we make, man. And we're also out of toilet paper. I'm just buying what people tell me to buy. I don't even know why. I don't care why. It's not my job. Somebody somewhere said we needed something and said, go buy it. So I'm trying to find a good price. That's all I'm asked to do. So quit bugging me with why. Therefore, it's 100% accurate. It just is. They're either buying more, buying less, or buying the same. And then finally, it's easy to read. The diffusion index holds that anything over 50 is expansion. Anything under 50 is contraction. We've been in expansion territory for 20 years. We have a big drop in 2020, as one would expect, but rocketed back into 2021, hitting numbers in the 60s that we had not seen in years, predominantly because companies were loading up on inventory. They were reacting to the supply chain, doing whatever they could to get back up to speed, and that provoked a lot of buying, a lot of purchasing. Now we're starting to settle back to a bit more normal level. The last reading was about 55.1, so still very strong. We should be getting a new one here shortly, which would indicate where we are. But even the new orders index is up in the 50s and 60s. So looking at this, which has been a very accurate assessment of kind of the industrial community and the service sector, because the index is done for both manufacturing and services, and both of them have been performing above 50 in the positive territory. And you're seeing it internationally. IHS Market does this for countries all over the world, 38, I think, altogether. Every country in the world except for China and Russia have been in positive territory. Even Mexico, in the last reading, moved out of contraction. Not by much. It went from like 49.3 to 50.1. So it's not bolstered, it's not up in the mid 50s. It's not as strong as others, but it's getting respectable. And you see a lot of countries in there that are in the high 50s, 59.9, Ireland at 59. I mean, it's just, generally speaking, the purchasing manager globally is showing expansion. And this is a reaction to supply chain adjustments. We just sort of know the drill. We've been watching it for several months. The ASEAN nations are taking advantage of the supply chain crisis in China by stepping up their own exports. Vietnam is doing 80% more business with the United States than they did a year ago. And it's simply as they're trying to fill in where China has been dropping the ball. A lot more commodity activity coming out of South America. This last week was a pretty seminal meeting between Biden and some of the South American countries. And it both illustrated how the economies of those countries are responding, but it also indicates some of the political tension that exists. Several of them did not even attend. Mexico refused to come unless the United States invited Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which we refused to do. So the Mexicans did not come. Brazil was not sending its highest delegation either because they're in the middle of an election. You're seeing a lot of potential shift within the governance within Latin America. Brazil's in a very hotly contested electoral position now between Bolsonaro, the current president, and the return of Lula, who was president 10 years ago, and is now making something of a comeback. Maybe a change in Colombia, maybe a change in others. Europe, or the Peruvian government is now in the hands of Alberto Castillo, who's from the left. Chile is in the hands of a left-wing government. Argentina is as well. A lot of changes going on in Latin America, which we've sort of not noticed because we've been so preoccupied with what's going on in China and Ukraine that we sort of overlook our neighbors to the south. A couple of sectoral things that, again, we're sort of aware of. The housing market, people keep talking about its demise. I mean, every time you turn on TV, it's like it's about ready to die. There's going to be a bubble burst. It's all horrible. It's up 18% year over year. It is continuing to grow. It is off the peak that it saw in 2021, but it's still growing. Some of that is probably preemptory buying, people trying to get ahead of mortgage rate increases. But a lot of it is simply that we still need lots more housing. We are still short 5 million homes in the US as a whole, and we only build about 1.5 to 1.7 million a year. So we've got at least a 5-year runway of new home construction just to meet current demand, much less the new demand coming on. Lots of what's been changing on the housing side has been generational. The millennial was very, very slow to get into the housing market. And when they did, it was mostly multifamily. That's changing. The older millennial is now having family. They put that off too, much to their chagrin, because now they're understanding why people had kids when they were 20. Because if you have children when you're 20, you're too young to realize what a disaster that's going to be. You haven't had an opportunity to really enjoy your life. So it's like, oh, let's have kids. You have kids when you're 30, and it's like, oh man, I used to go out and do stuff. I used to spend money on myself. I used to buy toys for myself. I haven't spent money on myself in months because I have children. And there's just this giant sucking sound that I hear from my wallet as I pay for everything for kids. So the millennials are catching up, and they realize that living in a multifamily environment with children is a disaster. So now they're starting to look for suburban opportunities, looking for homes that have a moat and razor wire, anything they can think of to ease the pain of parenthood. So it's still a very live market. We also see a difference in the way people move now. My generation, even into the Gen Xers, when you got a job, you moved to where the job was. So you got a job with a company in Duluth or Reno, Nevada, or Birmingham, Alabama, and you moved there because, well, that's where the job was. So you had to. You didn't choose to say, well, of all the places in the United States, I want to live in Duluth. Today, a lot of people are getting jobs that can be done from anywhere. They're working remotely. So the company in Duluth hires you, but what you do for them can be done remotely. And you say, look, I don't want to live in Duluth. I want to live in Austin. Fine, live in Austin. You work for us, but we don't care where you live. So you get these communities that really should have burst at the seams a long time ago because they're not providing enough jobs. They don't have to. Talking to the city manager in Austin, he says, we don't have to provide jobs. We have 200 people a day moving into Austin. They already have jobs. They're already working remotely for somebody, so they just want to live here as opposed to wherever the company is that hired them. So the Nashvilles and the Austins and the Phoenixes of the world just keep growing because people want to live there, and it's no longer connected to the local employment situation. You've seen that even in states that maybe are not quite as well known as destination states. The Chamber of Commerce in Des Moines now considers Des Moines, Iowa to be a suburb of Chicago. So many people are working remotely for companies in Chicago, And they got to looking at cost of living and said, I can get a whole lot more house in Iowa than I can in Chicago. So why don't I just keep working for the company in Chicago? I can go in 2 or 3 times a month, no big deal. But I, meanwhile, am dealing with much less expensive housing back in Iowa. On the non-residential side, you're seeing a lot of growth in warehouse construction, logistics, break bulk facilities, all of that stuff. Slowing down a little bit, but not markedly. Amazon is still responsible for 25% of all the warehouse development in the United States. They have been closing some of their facilities, but if you look at what they're doing, they tend to be closing some of the smaller facilities because a larger one that's within shouting distance is more efficient. So they're sort of shutting down some of the less efficient warehouse operations. They're also becoming a little more attuned to where the transportation grids are. And they're trying to be sure that they're sort of matching up with where the expansion is likely to be, both in terms of rail and highway. One example of how this is shaping, particularly the Midwest, and I promise I won't go into detail in this either, but just enough to make the point. Kansas City Southern Railroad is the smallest of the Class 1 railroads. Everyone has had their eye on KCS for years because they have the best penetration into Mexico. They bought the second largest Mexican railroad a number of years back. So every big manufacturing community in Mexico is connected through KCS. Querétaro and San Luis Potosí and Monterrey and Saltillo and on and on. Canadian Pacific is the second smallest Class 1. When they put up a bid for KCS, they got approval. The Surface Transportation Board would not allow Union Pacific or BNSF or Norfolk Southern, any of the big guys, to buy KCS, but they would let the two smallest Class 1s merge. So now you have a new competitor with the stated aim, and this is what the Canadian Pacific people said when they ponied up $33 billion to buy the KCS. We plan to divert 40% of the freight that's coming into the west coast of the United States to the middle of the US. We're going to rail it in from Vancouver and from Lázaro Cárdenas, a port in Mexico that KCS controls, bring it up to the middle of the US, the middle of Canada, the middle of Mexico, and do the break bulk there. And that ends up adding something like 800,000 to 1.7 million containers a week to the middle of the United States. So that warehouse distribution expansion will continue in the middle of the country, just following where this rail development is taking place. Job openings, yeah.
Hey, real quick. So we've got about 20 minutes left. I know you have a lot of great content still to go over, including not housing, but some other slides. I know that Rob Stone has a question in the chat, and
You bet.
well, I don't want to skip anything you've got, but at the same
No,
time,
please. I've seen these slides, so I don't care if we get to them. So
well, I know there's a lot of good content in there. So, Rob, why don't you pose your question to Chris?
Hey, Chris, this is really interesting, and I appreciate you taking the time. My question is, I live in the Seattle area near Bellevue, and Bellevue right now is like, if you look across the skyline, there's like 10, maybe more construction cranes. So there's millions of square foot of office space being built. I know a lot of it is Amazon. I think maybe like a third of it, but that amount of commercial construction, specifically office space, seems to be sort of like orthogonal to the notion of people are going to work from home forever. Right. Where do you come out on that? Because it's not absolutes, like it must be in the office or must work from home. There's a hybrid middle, but like, what is your take on all that? Because that's a lot of money being spent for people never to go to the office.
Yeah, exactly. What you're starting to see is a resurgence in office development, but in a different way, where companies are saying, we may not build the big, massive campuses that we used to, because now we're going to have people that are working remotely and all this, and we're going to have people coming in for 2 days and working home for 2 days. The new model, theoretically, is 2-3-2. 2 days in the office, 3 days working remotely, 2 days for the weekend. But what you're now seeing are smaller office buildings, more kind of attuned to where people are living. So if you've had a lot of people that have moved to the exurbs, well, then you put an office building out there. So if you now want them to come to work, they're not commuting all the way to the center city. You see a lot of that around Chicago, around LA, and you're also seeing it up in the Northwest. So the office building has not died, it's metamorphosed, and it's becoming a little more kind of open design, more shared space, that kind of stuff. And frankly, we're now familiar with the limitations of remote work. Companies were like, yeah, this is a great idea in the beginning, but now we've discovered it's hard to manage people you don't see. It's hard to onboard new employees because you don't know them and you've never met them. And it's just much harder on supervisors who don't have the ability to kind of walk around and check in on people. You know, they're waiting for a Zoom call. And as we all know, this isn't a normal environment. You know, we can't do in a Zoom call what we do in a real meeting. You know, we're not having the little conversations off to the side, you know, where, because nothing's private. I mean, you can't gossip about Laura on a Zoom call, you know, because she's right there, you know. So it's a one of those things that we're kind of shifting back, and office construction is now taking place again, but different, that it's a little bit smaller, a little bit more spread out, more shared space. The biggest alterations have probably been the accounting firms, the law firms, where they really never did use their offices as extensively as some businesses because their employees were on the road. Does that kind of answer your question?
I mean, it does. It's just that, and some of this may be just like, you know, the Elon Musk announcement a couple of days ago of like, we'll consider your, you know, your resignation if you don't show up in the office, like
Right.
you will be back in the office. The amount of money that's being spent just in my local area on office construction just seems to be very much in conflict with what I see in the recruiting parts of my job, of people saying like, I'm not going to take this job if it's in the office. And
Right.
part of that might be a factor of it is a candidate's market right now, but
Right.
2-3 years from now, it probably will flip completely, where people's position will change when it's like, I need money. And people say, well, this is an office job. And they say, okay. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I'm wondering about in my head as we think about all this.
And I think that's a fair point, because you know, you've always got different motivations for where you want people to work, and control is a big part of it. I mean, you know, you're dealing with, and not to make any comments about Elon Musk, the man's very control oriented. You know, I don't think he likes having people do things that he can't see and control. And a lot of organizations are the same way. They don't want that distance where they don't know what people are up to. And then the other thing is the motivation. When people were asking to work remotely before, it was around COVID. It's like, I don't want to be at risk. Now you're getting people saying, well, I'm not so worried about COVID. I am worried about $6 a gallon gas. So if you're asking me to commute to work, I want you to understand that it's costing me $100 a day just to get to work and back. And so either don't make me come in or give me a raise, because right now I'm losing money working for you. And that's going to be a factor too, at least until gas prices come down. But I think it's going to be pretty idiosyncratic. There are, like, I work a lot with accountants. I'm the economist for a bunch of accounting associations. The accountants are like, oh, we're staying remote. We don't really like being around people anyway. If we had personalities, we wouldn't be accountants. And so, you know, we're gonna never buy a pair of pants again and just work on Zoom. Salespeople, marketing people, anybody that has to work collaboratively, bankers cannot stand remote, because their whole world is built on relationships, which they can't build in a Zoom call. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot of separation. Manufacturers, construction, that was never an option. You know, as a manufacturer, you can't take the laser cutter home. You know, you sort of have to be where it is. So yeah, I think it's a fluid situation. And the people we work with in construction are like, yeah, we saw a complete death of office development. Now it's back. but it's slightly different, and more attention to design, shared space, all that kind of stuff.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'll blow through the next couple of these slides real fast because we've already talked about most of this already. Job openings. We have a lot of job openings. 11.5 in January, continuing to grow. Lots of opportunities, don't have the people with the right training. Wage growth is now a major issue. And this isn't going away anytime soon. I'm always on the verge of a rant when it comes to this because it's not like we didn't see it coming. I mean, I was reading the other day, the airlines are canceling it. Southwest canceled 20,000 flights this summer, 4% of their flights, because they don't have pilots. And it's like, excuse me, did you not notice that age was chronology? You know, that if you were 60 this year, you're going to be 61 next year. You don't get to go the other way. I mean, you can't fly backwards and become 59. You knew this was coming. And we knew that people were going to be getting older. The moment the boomers were born, eventually they're going to hit 65. And we now see them hitting 65 at the rate of 10,000 a day. And we've sat on our hands for 20 years going, you know, maybe if we ignore it, it'll go away. It didn't. So we're getting back to normal. Talked about this before. We're starting to get back into that box where sales and inventory match up the way they're supposed to, which is good news. Oil we've talked about already as well. We produce a lot more oil than we used to. We're going to be hitting about 13 million barrels per day in the coming year, but we consume 20 million barrels a day, and that leaves a gap of about 7. Most of that will come from Canada, some from Mexico. We don't do much with the rest of the world. We do a little bit with the Middle East. Most of that production ends up going to Europe or Asia. We're still pretty hemispheric. We rely on our own hemisphere for most of our production, and increasingly we produce our own. But there are all kinds of discussions about, you know, what we shouldn't do, etc. One quick story just to indicate how goofy this conversation can be. You hear a lot of people talking about the Keystone Pipeline. And the reason we're in trouble is we didn't build the Keystone Pipeline. When that was an issue, I remember being a little confused because the official word in the media was that the pipeline had been stopped or stalled by environmentalists in Nebraska concerned about the sandhill crane. I'm from Kansas. I'm right beneath Nebraska. I know that nothing matters in Nebraska except Husker football. And if they had ever heard of a sandhill crane, it would be, can you shoot it and eat it? It's Nebraska. It is not the Berkeley of the Plains. Where is this opposition coming from? A friend of mine at the Omaha Herald had the same question, wanted to know why the grassroots group had a staff of 12 and one of the most expensive offices in downtown Lincoln. He looked into where their money came from. All of it came from rail. The rail carriers wanted to haul that oil too. Union Pacific is headquartered in Omaha. BNSF is owned by Warren Buffett from Omaha. They managed to stall the pipeline for 2 or 3 years, long enough to build the infrastructure for rail, because the oil producers would rather ship by rail. That way they can send the oil anywhere in the country that wants it rather than shipping it to a pipeline center in Cushing, Oklahoma. So back to my comment earlier, follow the money. Why was the Keystone delayed? Had little or nothing to do with the environment, had a lot to do with the contest between rail and pipeline, which has been going on for decades. Transportation demands finally falling off a little bit, so we're dealing with our congestion issues on the ports. We are now not in as vulnerable a place when it comes to truck capacity. We were looking at 14 loads for every truck. Now it's about 4 loads for every truck, so we're starting to catch up. We have had 68,000 new trucking companies come into existence in the last 2 years, because it's a very, very easy industry to get into. Someone says, I want to be in trucking. What do I need? A truck and a CDL. So if I get a CDL license in a truck, I can go into trucking? Yep. All you have to do is find somebody who wants to haul something and you're in business. So people come in and out of it really fast. And you've had a lot of new entries. Most of them will probably be gone in another year or two when the capacity starts to tighten up again. As I mentioned earlier, we're kind of back to maybe 43%. The prediction originally was that we were going to be at 80% occupancy by now. And obviously we're way short of that. Much higher in some parts of the country than others. You know, Dallas, much higher, Houston, much higher, much lower on the coasts. So with that, I am going to shut up and take questions. For those of you who just can't get enough of this, recognize that I am just as long-winded in an email as I am in person. So feel free to send me email questions as something occurs. The publication that we do is now called the Flagship. We basically merged the business intelligence brief with the Black Owl report so that Keith and I were writing for the same thing rather than for different publications. We come out every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It's a whopping $7 a month, cost of a caramel macchiato at Starbucks. And there's also a free trial available. So, and in the months to come, we're going to be doing a lot more with COO Forum, kind of producing material for them and becoming more engaged. So stay tuned. Laura and Chuck and I have been working on what that exactly looks like and how to be helpful and not overwhelm your inbox. Any
Absolutely.
questions?
I have a question, Chris. Thanks again, as always, for your presentations, always so insightful. Question about, do you sense any sort of long-term impacts on the energy sector as a result of the price of oil? We're going to see increasing moves to solar and wind in this country, or do you think that's still won't maybe potentially just be a temporary blip there?
Yeah, I think you will see a tremendous impact, and it will not be towards solar and wind, because what you now have seen are investors looking at this going, oh, we're not ready, are we? We're not ready for solar and wind to replace fossil fuels. The Energy Information Agency has said all along that we're going to be 70% dependent on fossil fuels at least till 2050. And just in the last 2 or 3 months, you have seen tremendous interest in LNG development in Pennsylvania. There's investment pouring into the tar sands in Canada, and those are like the dirtiest conceivable way to produce oil and had virtually been abandoned because of climate change. Now they're back. The transition is going to be tough because as people want to go towards the alternatives, they also learn the limitations. Like Russia, or not Russia, Germany had invested a lot in wind power with an eye towards offsetting what they got from Russia. So the very year that they really needed to do this, the wind did not blow in Europe. And they've been getting 25% of the energy they thought they would get from wind. So now everyone is like, wow, maybe we moved away from fossil too fast. The French, kind of typically of the French, are saying, well, yeah, that's why we stuck with nuclear. So we don't want to use fossil fuels either, nor do we want to be dependent on the vagaries of wind and sun. So I think you'll still see development, but you're now going to see investment coming back to fossil fuel. Maybe a new emphasis on making fossil fuels cleaner, more attention to sequestering CO2, more orientation towards burning cleaner. That kind of got put by the wayside as people were moving more towards the electric vehicle, but it's still less than 5% of the total US fleet. So people say, well, you know, if you could make the internal combustion engine more efficient, wouldn't that help? So yeah, it's we had kind of a sober reawakening. People are all for alternatives until the price per gallon hits $6. And then all of a sudden it's like, do something, develop oil now, fast, immediately. Oh my God, it's $6. It's like, well, yeah, but it takes time, children. So anything else?
Chris, this is Rob Stump. Question for you. If you were sitting in one of our seats as a COO, and of course, we've got responsibility for day-to-day delivering. At the same time, we've got to be looking out and doing scenario planning. And by the way, I really much appreciate your presentation because as the old saying goes, knowledge is power. And you've given us additional knowledge today that kind of counteracts some of the things we're hearing and the fear that recession strikes in the heart of grown men and women.
Oh, you bet.
So I guess my question would be, as you look at the horizon, how should we be thinking? How should we be planning? How should we be operating? I realize that's a very broad context to throw out there, but just anything you could add to that would be great.
Yeah, I guess my overall take, and I advise a lot of my clients kind of similarly to what you're asked to do for your companies. The two things that are distorting everything right now, the supply chain crisis and the Ukraine war. So as long as those two things are front and center, you've got crisis atmosphere. But both of them can vanish within a fairly short period of time. So as a COO or anybody setting strategy, you kind of have to have two plans in place. You've got plan one, which is, okay, China is going to continue to have supply chain issues. The Ukraine war is not going to end for months. Energy prices are going to stay high. So I need to be prepared for this kind of price pressure, supply chain pressure. Scenario number two is that China backs away from the zero tolerance thing, and there's a lot of pressure in China to do that. And we get some kind of a movement towards settlement in Ukraine. And suddenly the supply chain starts to function again, and oil prices drop. So you don't want to make a decision that commits you to some very expensive response when it may reverse. And so it puts you in a very bad position saying, I don't know if the hurricane's going to hit my house. It's heading that way. So I'm going to put up all these barriers, but I'm not going to make it permanent because it might miss me. At which point you're kind of stuck having both an optimistic and pessimistic scenario. My gut feeling is that both of these begin to diminish by the end of the year. I don't see how either Russia or Ukraine can keep this up much longer. One or the other of them is going to have to crack. And it feels to me like the Russians are already starting to kind of pull on Afghanistan. Remember that they finally got to the point in Afghanistan, like, this is hopeless. We are not going to win. This is ridiculous. We can't. We won. We're leaving. It's like, what do you mean you won? We did. We won. See, we said we won. We won. We're gone. See ya. Kind of like we did. It's like, we've been here for 20 years. Are we accomplishing anything? No, but we're done. We're leaving. And that may be what happens in Ukraine. It's like, okay, we did what we set out to do. What did you set out to do? Never mind. Whatever it was, we did it. And we're leaving now. And suddenly the whole conversation starts. China, without going into geopolitics, Li Keqiang is pushing so hard on Xi to reverse policy. Li Keqiang was supposed to be the next leader of China, not Xi. But he got caught up in a scandal out in China, blah, blah, blah. He still wants to be head of China. And he is publicly going after Xi, saying, you are destroying the Chinese economy over this stupid COVID policy. You blew it. You need to step down. And if that happened, you'd have a pretty radical shift in China pretty quickly. Li basically says, hey, the reason we have a problem with COVID is that we invested in our own damn vaccine, which isn't very good. And, it only protects about 45% of the time, but you went with it because your buddy runs the company that produces it. In my book, Xi, that's corruption. And he's saying that publicly, and the Chinese press is picking it up. So, yeah, geopolitics can be fun. As an old Soviet analyst, I remember you used to be able to tell where people were in the hierarchy by where they stood. And we've seen that in China. And the head of the Chinese military has been standing to the right of Xi for years. For the last month and a half, he's been standing to the right of Li Keqiang. And so it's kind of like, if he switches sides, that's not good news for G.
Well, that'll be the last word because we have 1 minute left, and that was like perfectly timed. Thank you so much, Chris. Really appreciate it. Look forward to, I know we'll see you again soon. So
You will.
if anybody has any questions, Chris's email, I'll post it in the e-forum. And if you're not in the e-forum yet as a member, just let me know and I can make that connection for you. Next meeting is Tuesday, the 21st at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And everybody should have gotten an invite to that one. If you didn't, just let me know and I can shoot that out to you. But everybody have a great weekend and enjoy. And thanks again, Chris. Thanks everybody.
You're welcome. Thanks.